when they saw how they lived, they'd understand something about that God and how he's better than theirs.
So we're going to jump to the law genre, the top of page 28. The key characteristic I want to talk about when it comes to law is asking, what is the purpose of each law? Right? Where are most of the laws in the Bible found? Leviticus. Yeah, you know, you start picking them up in Exodus around chapter 20, and then you got a number in Leviticus and a whole bunch more in Deuteronomy, right? So that's those first 5 books of the Bible we call the Torah, right? A Hebrew word for instruction, because there's just a whole lot of instructions in there. In those books of the Bible, there are certainly laws that are mentioned, referred to, commanded, delivered elsewhere in Scripture, but that's where we find the first and the most and highest concentration of them. But, right, there's something that we have to know about those laws in the Torah, and that is, those were the laws that ordered and determined how Israel's relationship worked with God under the Mosaic covenant, under the Old Covenant. And so, right, so now Jesus came, and, you know, you remember what he said when he's at the Last Supper, like, okay, my blood, my body, my sacrifice, it's setting up a new covenant, and the book of Hebrews talks all about that. There used to be priests and sacrifices and laws and everything Moses did and all of that, and Aaron, and now there's me who has delivered the once-for-all sacrifice, and so that old covenant is about to be completely wiped away. He was referring to the time when the temple would be destroyed. That's kind of the capstone of putting on, like, there's no more of that left. The new covenant is what I've set up. And so, you know, Jesus himself said, you know, let's boil everything down to, you know, love God, love your neighbor. He gave a lot more tips of what that looks like, teaching on how to do that. You know, but those of us who are believers in Christ, followers of Christ, we look to Jesus, and he said, you know, kind of, okay, that old covenant disappeared. Now it is the person who obeys, you know, my words is the one who's on my team, in my kingdom, part of this community. So there has been a switch from the old covenant to the new covenant that we now live in, which means, and kind of brings up the question, what do I do with all these old covenant laws that I'm not responsible to live under? Israel was, but they're still in here for our instruction. So how do they instruct us? Right? Because the reality is, right, you know, God is the same yesterday, today, forever, so certain ways of living are always going to hold true. We know this. It's not like, you know, parts of the 10 Commandments are like, oh yeah, that's no longer applicable. You know, I mean, you can go and read Paul's letters. He goes in and repeats every single one of the, you know, 10 commands as he's commanding people what to do and not to do and what that should look like. And so it isn't like all this stuff got washed to the side from the old covenant. No, the basic way in which God said, okay, I want you to, you know, live with each other with respect, i.e. don't kill each other, you know, love your spouse, you know, don't covet someone else's. I mean, those things are all repeated and carried forward. But what do we do with the laws that aren't kind of the heart and soul of the 10 Commandments, that aren't kind of these general, kind of the general moral guidance that still holds true because Jesus taught it, the apostles taught it? What do we do with laws about, hey, I don't want you to wear wool and cotton in the same piece of clothing, right? That's back there in the beginning of the Bible. Okay, that's a weird one. What do we do, you know, with laws about how much I should repay someone if I steal their donkey? I have the option to just say, well, that stuff's crazy. I'm not going to do anything with it. But what if I find myself, as I'm reading through the Bible, you know, looking at these laws and trying to go, okay, so what do I do with that? What can I learn from that? If I'm not responsible to to bring a certain, offering to the temple, if I'm not, responsible to do a certain thing with my neighbor's ox when he gets out of the cage, is there anything left to learn? And I'd say yes, and I'd say focus on the purpose that those laws had. Because there is much of what God is about, which shows up in every culture. It just gets contextualized, that is fitted for that situation. And so they had donkeys and a certain way of having houses and a certain way of being in a community that are different than we do now. But the purpose of the instructions we can go in and figure out many times and then go, okay, what would that look like to accomplish the same thing but in a different community today? And here is the comment I'd love for you to write down about the purpose of these laws. Because as a whole, the laws had a purpose. Individual laws have them. But as a whole, Israel's laws had this purpose. And that is, they were instructions for Israel to create a compassionate and just community that stands out in a pagan world of oppression and injustice. We don't always see it at first, but all these strange laws in Leviticus and all the laws added in Deuteronomy, it's so that Israel wouldn't act and look like their neighbors. It's so that when people would go, that's a different nation with a different God that lives a different way. And when they saw how they lived, they'd understand something about that God and how he's better than theirs. Okay, and so you had a world, full of sin in all sorts of crazy ancient Near Eastern ways, and the laws given to Israel were to have them stand out in the ancient Near East and be a witness of who their God is in terms of how they lived. Let's look at this in just in one simple way, and that is I ask a question about part of the logic upon which many of the laws in the Old Covenant are built on, which we can read about if you turn to Exodus 21:23. It says, "But if there is any further injury, then you shall appoint as a penalty life for life, eye for eye, tooth for tooth, hand for hand, foot for foot, burn for burn, wound for wound, bruise for bruise." So it's in the context of a bunch of laws that says kind of if someone does this, then here's kind of the equal and appropriate penalty to be meted out. A bunch of laws that are based on this principle. An eye for an eye, a tooth for a tooth. We're probably familiar with that. Of course, I asked the question, man, that sounds like you hit me in the face, I hit you in the face, and you kick me in the shin, I kick you in the shin, and you shoot me in the arm, and I shoot you in the arm. And it sounds a little, that just sounds kind of out of this, not quite right in our culture, in our context. For many of us, for some of us. So, I've asked the question, how is the legal rationale, eye for an eye, tooth for a tooth, a form of justice and not primitive brutality? Shouldn't it be like, you punch me in the face, but I rise above and forgive you and say, man, I understood that was a mistake. And then you say, that forgiveness is so profound, thank you, I'm never going to do that again. Right? Shouldn't that be it? Man, this old covenant stuff is so brutal, so just, man, like misbehaving boys. Okay, well, if he hits you, I'll hold him, you hit him, Here's why this made a lot of sense back then, okay? From the records we have, there were just what we call cycles of vengeance that had no end. Okay, and in fact, actually, there's a whole bit if you read it in these first 5 books where it talks about early on in Israel's life, they developed cities of refuge where if one of these cycles of vengeance got started, here's how to stop it. Okay, kind of like, I punched you, you kicked me, I stole your donkey, you ripped my leg off. so I killed your mother. So now so now we have a family feud, and we're just left and right attacking each other. Because God had to be like, okay, this is the normal way of life here in the ancient Near East. Oh boy, how are we going to put a stop to this? So they came up with a plan for, we're going to have like little cities where if you go here, you're safe. No one can kill you. It's not right. Because this was a big problem of just tit for tat, just growing, bigger, tribe against tribe, family against family, to the point where, and you still have this today in different places around the world, and where it's like one tribe just knows that they're supposed to kill people from another tribe, and they don't really know why that started. We're just supposed to do it. They probably heard the last story of when the other guys were mean to them, and so they know that they need to find a time to be mean back. So the eye for eye, tooth for tooth, is a way of stepping in and so, okay, we're going to stop this brutality. We're going to stop this just endless cycle of sin and violence towards one another. Okay, if they did this, then here's what happened, and it's over. Here's the punishment, and it's done. We stop. Okay? So if he stole your donkey, and then and then he's got to give it back, times 2, and then we're good. And you're not angry because you had to pay him back, and you're no longer angry because he stole it the first time. Whew. So it was designed to have a clear and appropriate punishment to stop the escalation. Well, if that's what's going on back then, and that's the rationale behind a number of the laws that were trying to put an end to sin, and deal with the sense of I've been wronged and the feelings, to calm them down, to appease. If that's one of the purposes behind that rationale, and that fulfilled this desire to have a just and compassionate community that stood out in a world of kind of uncontrolled violence, oppression, injustice, aggression, etc. Well, what do we do now when we come back to some of these laws and are trying to make sense of them for today? That is what I think is the most difficult about using or interpreting these laws. So let me make a few comments about it. And there's a few blanks to fill in here in your notes. So, obedience. What do Old Covenant instructions mean for New Covenant Christians? Since Jesus introduced the New Covenant and founded its new ethic upon his words and example, we no longer are responsible to order our lives by the covenant agreement between God and ancient Israel. However, the intent of the Torah to create a compassionate and just community that stands out in a pagan world of oppression and injustice can still give us a trajectory to follow. So, Christians should seek to first understand what a law was intended to accomplish. So first, understand what a law was intended to accomplish in ancient Israel, and then seek to develop a contextualized way to accomplish the same purpose. Now, the comment there at the end is quite important. Many sacrificial and purity laws can only be imitated through Christ's finished work. So many of those about ceremonies, sacrifices, offerings, in many of those, you're just going to say, oh yeah, they were doing that because they knew that there had to be a sacrifice for the sin that they had committed, but now we know all of that got wrapped up into one. Or all the talk about what priests were supposed to do to keep themselves pure so that they could be an adequate mediator between God and the people. So Jesus said, like, I am that one mediator between man and God. Okay, yeah, so he was the pure and perfect one who did that. Check. So we see those more fulfilled and wrapped up in the work of Christ. But what do we do with other laws, such as the one you'd find in Deuteronomy 22, verse 8? Turn there. This is one of my favorite laws. I don't know why. It's probably just because I'm a Bible geek, but hopefully you'll enjoy the ride. It's just when, Some of you have probably taken on the challenge of reading the Bible all the way through, and so you start off in some pretty slow trudging as you hit Leviticus, Numbers, Deuteronomy. But as you're trudging through there, some interesting laws pop out, like Deuteronomy 22, verse 8, that says, when you build a new house, you should make a parapet for your roof. Hopefully you have a better translation than mine. That's just not a word we use a lot. A parapet for, I'm like, you want pets on my roof? Or, which is better than being in your house, in my opinion. But, so make a parapet for your roof so that you will not bring blood guilt on your house if anyone falls from it. Based on your translation or on that context, you understand. They're saying, hey, put a little wall or a barrier around your roof. Okay, back then it made sense to go, most of them used a portion at least of their roofs. You could go up there, dry things off, but keep them where it was accessible to you. There was a lot of different things they'd do up there. And so since kids and neighbor kids would be up on your roof, let's just make sure they're not going to fall off. At first, when I read something like this, it's so practical, it almost seems out of place. Right? We're used to kind of these grandiose things about how you're supposed to be, physically pure, so you're prepped to go to the temple, things that come across as more spiritual, or things that seem more moral in nature. So you come to a verse that's all about, really? One of the 613 laws in the Torah is put a fence around my roof? This is the equivalent of if you have a pool, you should have a fence around it. You don't want the neighbor kids running through, 2-year-old falling and drowning. It's like, well, yeah, that's a good point. I'll do that. So normal. But I think it's really, really important for us to pay attention to the normal laws that are strewn back through these first few books of the Bible. That there is a concern that those of us who want to embody the values of God in this world, it just isn't about doing, large feats for God. It just isn't about having, large, unusual, spiritually focused gatherings. It works into the details of thinking about the way you live so that you don't accidentally harm someone. Love gets into all of the details. Love cares that much to not kill a neighbor kid by having him fall off your roof. Right? And sometimes we think, well, that's base. That sounds like, a regulation that the government would set up just to, make it more expensive to build my house. Well, yeah, it does sound like that. But, our God cared about those kinds of things too. So even when we're figuring out the purpose of these ancient laws that you'd say, I don't have to obey that, we learn something about who God is by understanding the purpose of these laws that he put in place for a community that he wanted to reflect who he is. You see, in God's kind of community, there aren't high death rates from preventable causes. He's not into that. He's not okay with that. Not today, not in our world, not back then, in Israel. So I hope you see there's a lot more we could do with other laws and do the same exact thing.